Hello, good day, and welcome to another episode of the 905er podcast. My name is Roland Tanner.
I am Joel McLeod.
Today we're welcoming back Karl Dockstader and Sean Vanderklis to speak again about the latest developments that touch on the dispute at 1492 Landback Lane on the edge of Caledonia and the Six Nations Reserve about 20 kilometres south of Hamilton. Sean and Karl host a fantastic radio show called One Dish, One Mic on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. on AM 610 CKTB. You can also listen to current and past episodes by visiting iHeartRadio.ca and searching for One Dish, One Mic. It's a sad fact that the First Nations in the 905 region, as across Canada, tend to get coverage in the news when something happens that conflicts with the convenience of non-Indigenous Canadians. Invariably, money and property interests follow closely after. With that in mind, a declaration on April the 20th by the traditional chiefs of the Haudenosaunee people seemed calculated to grab attention. It declared a moratorium on all development in what is known as the Haldeman Tract, a large swathe of land running from Dunnville on Lake Erie to about 40 kilometres north of Orangeville in the north, and including in its boundaries almost the entirety of Brantford, Kitchener-Waterloo, along with many other smaller settlements. The tract was granted to the Haudenosaunee people in 1784 in return for their loyalty during the American Revolution. We wanted to find out more about this declaration, what the background is, and what it means in practice, as well as looking at the wider picture of the members of the First Nations who live in the urban and rural 905 region during COVID. Well, welcome back to the podcast, Karl Dockstader and Sean Vanderklis, who we had on about 6 months ago to talk about the Landback Lane story. And we've been wanting to kind of revisit the whole area again. And then last fall there was an announcement right here, the Haudenosaunee Council about the Haldeman Tract, basically stating that there should be declaring there will be a moratorium on building on that land as land that belongs to Saunee people. Well, I guess we'll start off with asking you, what's the purpose of this declaration and what are the implications for it? Karl, do you want to kick off?
Sure. So I actually went down and covered the press conference live in person, and it was definitely not something that the Haudenosaunee do often. Actually having a public press conference once every year or so, there might be an issue of such importance that they'll issue something like this. So the fact that the media was invited to the Longhouse itself just shows how significant this declaration and requirement for a moratorium was. It also shows, I think, that a lack of faith in any other process, that the Haudenosaunee felt the need to take this public in this way. What's really noteworthy, though, is that this declaration has been very consistent with what the Haudenosaunee have been asking for a generation now, since Dockstader, which was 15 years to the day of the OPP raid when the press conference was made, but also, honestly, for the past 7 generations. The Haudenosaunee have been very clear about cautioning against overdevelopment and sacrificing the environment for material gain for a select few when the health of the land affects us all. So they reiterated those principles of environmental stewardship. They also, what I thought was really key, and what I pulled out, and I hope this was reflected in my coverage, is that they actually did say they have faith in the Canadian people. They think that Canadians themselves are people that have values and share many values that the Haudenosaunee believe in, but it's the leadership, and they named the politicians specifically as the decision makers that are making these decisions and putting this kind of policy in place. So I thought that was noteworthy with the sort of heated highway through the Greenbelt debate that's happening, and even on a provincial level, who sets the kind of policy that allows expansionism the pushback there was around election time when the Ontario government or the prospective PC candidates were looking to form government. And as soon as they talked about the Greenbelt, it seems that a lot of people in Ontario share these principles of conservation that the Haudenosaunee mentioned.
Karl, for our listeners to understand, now the Haldeman Tract plot of land that we're talking about here is basically my understanding it's the Grand River with 6 miles on either side, if I'm not mistaken, under the original agreement from 17 whenever that was originally written. It's a sizable chunk of land that we're talking about here. Now, part of it I think does go up into the green belt itself, which presumably will be covered underneath the provincial legislation. But I mean, a good chunk of this is brushing up against some municipalities in the southern Ontario. What has kind of been the reaction from municipalities to this for this declaration?
Well, like Haldeman doesn't acknowledge Haldeman County itself, where the disputed land currently is. I mean, they don't even have like a territorial acknowledgement on their website. The history starts the second, according to the Haldeman County documents, the second that Indigenous people were on the land. So that sort of frames how a lot of this dialogue goes. But the reality of the situation is that, I mean, I can't speak for the Haudenosaunee, and I don't pretend to do that. But my interpretation is that it really wasn't until this urban expansionism came into place that there was all this concern about how the land would be used, because farmland tends to benefit all of us. And obviously conservation areas like the Greenbelt benefit all of us. But a housing development for a few hundred people benefits a few hundred people, and then the very small group of people that are going to make millions, hundreds of millions, potentially contribute to some billion-dollar companies along the way. So, but because municipalities need sources of revenue, I'm sure that they want to see. I mean, anybody who's looked at a municipal budget knows that anytime you have a new development, right? Like you're looking at, you can charge infrastructure costs and new development fees and all kinds of land transfer taxes and fees. So there definitely is a financial interest in municipalities to want to see these types of developments moving forward, because again, you're pumping millions of dollars into a budget, and you're effectively injecting cash, which they all want.
The way this was reported, I went and read the actual declaration that was made, and the some of the other statements have been made over the last decade or so about the Haldeman Tract lands, and I recommend anybody do that, because what you get in the newspaper tends to be, so superficial that it's almost misleading. But to take the kind of traditional view of this kind of thing that I suspect many Ontarians would sort of leap to, is like, these guys are trying to take my house away, by claiming kind of the entire Grand River kind of area as belonging to them. Is that what's going on here? Is this kind of like a are the First Nations of the Grand River area saying, okay, Canadians, you can't do anything here anymore, we're taking this land? Or is it much more nuanced than that?
I think it's more. I think it's a couple. There are a couple issues that we should look at. First off, is the recognition that this land is the rightful property of the Haudenosaunee and the Six Nations people themselves. Right, this was promised to them for them fighting alongside the British in the American Revolution while this was happening. They made an agreement. Thousands of people were sacrificed, lost their lives for their participation. As part of that agreement, they were promised, again, 6 miles on each side of the Grand River from the mouth to the source. Throughout time, throughout history, that's a huge parcel of land. I'm not sure if anybody is actually familiar with how big it is, but it is rather significant. And going back in time itself, if you look at how big it is, what would happen is people would just live on that land. Squatters would come up, take the land, live, cities were formed, communities were formed, villages were formed, so on and so forth. So I think the first step we need to consider is just the recognition of whose land it is, right? Going through all these historical documents to outline that it is the rightful owner. The Six Nations people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, are the rightful owner of the land. Second is, I don't think that it is as simple as saying, hey, we own the land, so the city of Caledonia, the township of Caledonia, you have to get out. You have to move, right? Caledonia being one of the prime examples of how relationships could work. Back in the day, Caledonia paid a renter fee or property fees to the Haudenosaunee. They agreed that they were going to rent this land from them, and they were going to pay a certain amount of dollars for X amount of years. What ended up happening is they never followed through. Once the contract expired, they just kind of ignored it and said, you know what, we're not going to pay. We don't have to pay. So I don't think it's about kicking people off the land. It's about acknowledging that we all have rights, we all have responsibilities, and we all have contractual obligations that we need to adhere to. And I think for the Six Nations, and again, not to speak for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or the people of Six Nations, but I think what they're attempting to look for is that recognition of right.
And it's an important distinction here between. I remember back in about 2002, actually, before I actually lived in Canada, I visited the Joseph Brant Museum in Burlington, and a lovely elderly white lady explained to me the history of Joseph Brant, and I suspect that history was somewhat partial and inaccurate, as it turns out, but she meant well. And she talked about, I believe that was the first time I heard about the Haldeman Tract, and basically said this land was given to Joseph Brant, and then the Joseph Brant and the Haudenosaunee people kind of sold it back to Europeans. Now, that isn't obviously how the Haudenosaunee people see it. And I guess the difference is between land that you can sell in a kind of European concept of selling land, and also sovereignty, wherein you can buy and sell land, but the land still belongs to the nation. If I sell land to Fred Bloggs, who lives down the road, it still belongs to Canada. I don't alienate land away from the nation. I just sell it, my interest in it. So I guess it's an awful lot of complexity for people to understand, but there's a lot of important distinctions there between kind of what actually happened back in 17, and I should look up the date, which I have right here on my screen, back in, was it 1784? And what's happened since in terms of how this land, the ownership of this land, is kind of perceived by the Canadian state.
I'm curious, what is their objective long term? Is it to reframe the relationship between the Canadian Crown and the Haudenosaunee leadership? Is it more of an economic pursuit? Is it an environmental pursuit? What is their objectives in making this declaration now? Sean, go ahead.
I want to say it's the assertion of their rights. Like, I mean, I think we're putting for lack of better terms, the horse before the cart, right? What we need to understand is that if you buy land in Canada, that is a legally binding contract. And what you do with said land is of no business to any other party, any other third party. And for the Haudenosaunee, what we have continuously seen is the illegal purchase, the illegal acquisition of land that's being taken from them. Spokesperson for the 1492 camp itself has gone on the record and saying that we are the only community who is getting smaller in size, and this has nothing to do with us. This is everything to do with governments, with cities taking the land, right? Let's keep in mind that what's happening in Six Nations is a recognized disputed land claim. There is dispute. The Canadian government acknowledges that there is a dispute. Hence the word dispute being used in all of it. But what's happening is people in Caledonia are proceeding while not even acknowledging that there is an issue, that there is a contentious issue. And what we're seeing is that assertion of ownership, that this is our land. I don't care what you seem to think. I don't care about your perception. This is our land. We're going to sell it the best way we see fit. Again, First Nations people in the country of Canada, we are confined to a limited amount of space via our traditional communities. My community of Curve Lake is that community. It's not going to get any bigger. I live in St. Catharines. We expand all the time. We do. The city of Welland expands all the time. Hamilton, Burlington, they're consistently expanding. They're consistently adding to their land base via amalgamations of cities and townships, so on and so forth, right? Like Niagara Region is during the last election, the Niagara Region was contemplating forming like a GTA, very much a GTA-like council, very much like again the GTA. So, but that doesn't exist. We're not afforded those same opportunities as other Canadians and other governments that exist in the country of Canada.
Yeah, Joel, thank you for the question. And I agree with everything that Sean has to say. And I agree with I appreciate Roland asking about Joseph Brant and the financial context. But what I really like, I just want to interject here is that land for me as a Haudenosaunee person, that land for me is not a material asset. This is not something that I own and that it's not an asset or a liability or, something on an expense statement somewhere that contributes to my overall equity. I want to echo what the Haudenosaunee chiefs were saying and saying that our connection to land is spiritual. So when you take a forest and you want to put a subdivision in the middle of it, imagine if someone went and wanted to plow through a church and make it into a condo development. Like just put it in that context for your listeners. I'm sure you have people of faith that listen to your program right now, and that's what we're talking about as Haudenosaunee people. Like, this isn't just some parcel of land, some acreage sitting out in the middle of anywhere. Our entire spiritual self, which is integral to who we are as a people, is connected to the land. So when you strip the earth off of the back of our mother and you plug in a bunch of electrical lines and telephone lines and internet lines and then put up these cookie cutter houses, it's debasing for us. It's hard to watch. It's difficult to explain to our children why this is happening. So, we can talk about Joseph Brant and we can talk about the economics and what the municipalities want, but this is, again, going back to, since we frame this around what the chiefs shared, this is very spiritually significant to Haudenosaunee people. And while I share their faith in Canadians to come around and hopefully urge their leaders to make good decisions, there is a difference in culture here, and that's why the two-row wampum and why the Treaty of Niagara and why the one dish, one spoon are so crucial to framing how these conversations should be happening.
Yeah, I just want to jump. I know you have something to say, Joe. I just want to jump in quickly. That's really the point I was trying to get at, is that this, as people of European background, overwhelmingly, we view things in this European. People like me view things in this European legal framework of property and transfer of lands, and that land can be transferred, which is completely alien to the entire context of how the Haldeman Tract came into existence and everything that's happened since. And I think that is so important. Sorry, Joel, you were about to ask a question.
I want to follow up on something that Karl just said, because before we were recording, we were just talking about this issue is coming up, and there's one thing that we've noticed, Roland, you and I, over recording issues of development and urbanization for this podcast, is this stuff is all connected. This isn't to take away from the importance of the land to the Haudenosaunee. It's a very valid point, but I would say that there are a number of white people who would share that importance, because we've seen we've seen claims that the people in Ontario do not want to see areas like the Greenbelt torn up. They want to stop the urban sprawl into these areas. They want to stop this. And I think that it's important to make a point that while we might be coming from different points of view, I do think that we ultimately want the same goal, is to keep this land free from just mindless sprawl. As you said, just building out neighborhoods and laying down track just to offset, property taxes for municipalities. We need to think better about this, and that there is a bit of a cross interest that at play here. Also, I don't think that just building out new developments and new neighborhoods solves any of our issues of urban development and housing shortage in the 905. Taking it away from the land that was promised doesn't solve our problems in terms of urbanization, and it definitely doesn't help our relationship with our First Nations partners in this country. Also, I thought Roland, you and I noticed something on we were digging at one part when the provincial government was talking about expanding the Greenbelt, and we noticed that, conveniently enough, that expansion stopped at Caledonia. The provincial government was talking about expanding the Greenbelt, and we noticed that where they ended it right at Caledonia, which I thought was very. I'm not going to say anything that in terms of motivation, but I found it very suspicious that if they expanded that Greenbelt designation into the area around Caledonia, a lot of issues would have been solved overnight. And conveniently enough, oh no, just right at that municipal line. Nope, that's where we're at.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, this is the age old story of a bullying realizing that he can bully people, right? It's really that simple. He's like, we're not going to touch these people, we're not going to deal with that, but we know historically that we can do this, right? When Karl was down in Six Nations covering the anniversary, that was 15 years removed from the last standoff with the OPP and the Ontario Provincial Police. And what that tells us is that again, they firmly believe that because this is contested land, because the waters are murky, that they can simply maneuver their way into ownership. And it's really that simple, is that we don't know what the answer is, right? And it's one of those old philosophies that it's easier to beg for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission, and that's essentially what we're seeing.
Let's. One of the things we also wanted to talk about today was that we're very aware that Indigenous issues tend to come into the news in Canada, in Ontario, when it's a matter of Indigenous rights coming up against Canadian rights. And there's so much more to Indigenous life than that. I know, Karl, that you are the executive director of the Friendship Centre in Niagara, I believe. And I have to say, Friendship Centres was something I was not aware of before, but actually deals with something that we've been wanting to look at, which is how Indigenous people operate within an urban environment. So away from places like Six Nations of the Grand River. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what friendship centres do, and also the challenges that are happening, obviously because of COVID, for First Nations people, Indigenous people living within an urban context in the 905 region.
Yeah, I mean, Sean and I can both speak to the Friendship Center movement. We're both self-identified Friendship Center babies, raised in this movement, and I would encourage your listeners to reach out to the Peel Indigenous Network that serves a lot of the 905, or if you have people write in, I guess you don't want the 416ers, so I won't talk about Council Fire or the Native Canadian Center in Toronto.
We have a very relaxed definition of 905.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure if 416ers are like prohibited or how that works. I don't want to wade into that muddy water. So.
No. Who?
Never heard of
right?
it.
If you're on Bloor Street, then no, just kidding. So The friendship centers, I think, were crucial to making sure that urban Indigenous people weren't forgotten in the vaccine rollout. Canada Land actually did a great podcast where they talked about how when Saul Mamakwa was accused of line jumping, he was actually advocating for housing in northern and remote communities. But the conversation was also being framed around urban Indigenous people being forgotten in the vaccine rollout. So we don't like. I'm from Oneida, which is near London, Ontario. I mean, Oneida territory spreads out in much bigger areas than that, but in a colonial sense, my so-called settlement reserve area is by London. So, but I was not part of their vaccine rollout because I live 200 kilometers away in Niagara Falls, Ontario. So, fortunately, in Niagara, public health has a great relationship with the friendship centers. And while there were some quirks, I would say that we're pretty close to a model partnership when it comes to having that strong friendship center presence. And other Indigenous organizations like our great Niagara chapter of Native Women, our Indigenous Diabetes Health Circle, Niagara Peninsula Aboriginal Area Management Board, the school board Indigenous organizations, Niagara College Indigenous Education got involved in the vaccine rollout. So, but we also had to because we were forgotten about from a policy standpoint. Just like with development, it became politically inconvenient for Indigenous people to be part of phase one. So we were able to get a lot of our elders into the phase one development, but it was supposed to be the whole Indigenous population that was supposed to be part of phase one. Unfortunately, the infant mortality rates are still 2 to 4 times higher in urban Indigenous settings. So just because we live in cities and just because there's more economic mobility for Indigenous people in cities doesn't mean that there's not still great inequity. And that would be in the 905 or down here in the, I don't know what we are, the 647. I'm going to get lost getting into area code talk here, but we're still, Indigenous people are making do with less here in the cities, and we're still being forgotten. But thank goodness for the Friendship Center movement.
Well, it was funny. We were doing some statistical digging, and people might not recognize this, but in Hamilton alone, the Indigenous population makes up 2% of Hamilton's population. I mean, that's not a small little insignificant number. That's a sizable community inside in Hamilton that makes up that contributes to the Hamilton way of life. And so when you talk about COVID-19 vaccination rollout, that is a huge community that you have to address and make sure that you get to them.
Yeah, like one of the things that we need to understand is that historically, since the 1950s, Indigenous people have been migrating from their traditional communities into urban environments, and that's really the basis of friendship centers. Is that when people from Six Nations and people from Mississauga of Credit First Nations made that decision to leave their communities, probably due to racism, probably due to colonial policies, they came into these urban cores like Hamilton, like Niagara, like Fort Erie, and established these friendship centers. The Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers, which is our provincial overseer, if you will, our provincial umbrella organization, has quoted that 85% of Indigenous people live in an urban environment. So when we talk about us being, 3 to 4% of the population, 85% of the 3 to 4 population of Canada, the country of Canada, lives in that urban environment. And that's why the work that Karl does via his role as executive director at the Niagara Regional Native Center, and the work that I do as a vice president on that board of directors is so important, is because we are the first point of contact for anybody coming into our communities. A lot of the programs that we provide are programs that cover from cradle to grave, essentially, from prenatal care to youth programming, to education, to adult literacy, to our seniors program, so on and so forth. So yeah, friendship centers are a fantastic tool. And if you listen to our last episode on One Dish, One Mic, that's why we are so critical of the federal government and their lack of acknowledgement of the good work that the Friendship Centers does and continues to do.
Yeah, I was listening to that episode, and you mentioned that until probably kind of during the Harper era, I think, friendship centers were viewed as like a core funding thing. So basically, something that is funded in perpetuity by the Canadian government. No ifs, no buts, no maybe. And that changed. So now you're treated like any other kind of non-profit organization that has to kind of bid for funding, I guess. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, back in the day, we had what was called evergreen funding. So it was pretty much status quo up until the Harper era was coming to the end, and now very much so. What we have seen is that our funding has consistently. The only time there has been change is when there's been a decrease in funding, and the federal government was the core program funders for our core programs. So our core programs included support for our executive director, support for like building and maintenance, receptionist, things of that nature, right? So it was really the meat and bones of what keeps our friendship centers up and operating. And the only time we've ever seen a change within my lifetime, I like to say that I'm a young guy, but I'm reaching that mid-30s level. But in my lifetime,
you're young, don't worry.
is when there has been a fundamental decrease.
The federal government pulled a really I was going to say douchebag move. Well, I've said it now. Douchebag move with the issue of what can happen because of the sort of overlapping jurisdiction of in the education and health field, as I understand it, is that you get disputes about who should be paying for healthcare for First Nations people, and there was kind of an agreement that, at least in the examples of children, that you would never let a child not receive healthcare because you're arguing over who's going to pay, and yet the federal government and the current Liberal federal government has not honoured that, as I understand it. Is that am I getting that right?
Yeah, 100%. So going back into the mid 2000s, there was this concept called Jordan's Principle, and to summarize what you just said, what essentially happened is that an Indigenous child left his community, went to an urban environment, received healthcare, was there for an extended period of time, and all of a sudden, the provincial and federal governments started to argue over who's financially responsible to foot this bill. And what ended up happening is they never resolved that, and this child ended up dying in hospital because of bureaucracy, right? And this is a prime example of what Indigenous people are still seeing and still witnessing today. One of the things that I would encourage your listeners to understand is that the very concept of human rights did not exist on First Nations communities in our traditional territories until 2008. And what that fundamentally means is that governments were legally and willingly able to discriminate against us based on the fact that we were First Nations, that we had status. And what we're seeing now, so that clause has been revoked and is now applicable. But what we're seeing now is Indigenous organizations, Indigenous advocacy groups holding the governments to account and taking them to court via whatever issue is of the day, right? So example being water. The government has not and does not provide adequate funding for our water systems on reserve on our traditional communities. So my reserve has filed a class action lawsuit against the federal government. Cindy Blackstock, the executive director of the Family and Child Caring Society, has held the government to account on several times, and has taken the government to court, to the Human Rights Tribunal, and the government has been found guilty of committing acts of discrimination against First Nations children. And they've been issued 7 non-compliance orders. Because they have not followed through on those non-compliance orders, the Human Rights Tribunal has since ruled that you are now legally responsible to pay $40,000 in compensation for every single individual who has been affected by your racist policies. And like this has been happening since the Harper era and has continued on into the Justin Trudeau era. I think the last time we spoke about it, the federal government's stance was that we need to We need to fully evaluate this, and we may challenge this decision, or we may not. And if anything, this is probably a good follow up for Karl and I on One Dish One Mic to see where they're at with that.
Yeah, and I guess this is to sum up that kind of dichotomy between what we're talking about, like a check for $18 million, and then this kind of almost penny pinching over, well, we don't know if we're going to accept that we have to support First Nations children when they go to hospital, is kind of typifies how I feel that the current government is handling Indigenous issues generally. Is like you throw checks at a question, but you're not willing to sit down and actually address the underlying problems, which is sitting down on a nation-to-nation basis with First Nations people, say in Caledonia or wherever. And instead it's like, well, if you write big enough check, maybe they'll go away. And it's like that's never gonna, that's never gonna solve the problems. Again, I mean, I'm kind of putting my own interpretation on things, which I shouldn't do. But does that sound like a reasonable kind of interpretation of this kind of government's modus operandi?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is them ducking and dodging their positions, right? So like when Justin Trudeau came into office, he said there's no relationship that is more important than the relationship of our Indigenous people. And one of the easiest and most fundamental things any government could do is to acknowledge that we have control and ownership of our own lives and our own destinies, that we are in fact sovereign, and that we can choose to live our lives the way we see fit. So they're not doing that, but then they are also throwing like partial monies at situations, but in a method that is misleading. Because when you hear $18 billion, like that's a lot of money. I will never see $18 billion in my lifetime, right? But they're throwing it out in this manner that is saying, like, look at us, good for us. We're committing record-breaking funding to Indigenous people. But again, what is on average? What is non-Indigenous people getting, right? It doesn't matter. Like, to me, this is a pass or fail. This isn't 70% is good, right? It is the rate of change that is the definition of racism itself. And while they have, and I will acknowledge that they have given out more money, is it on par with what everybody else is getting? If my son lived on reserve, would he receive the same quality of education? Would he have the same lifestyle that he has now living in an urban environment? And I want to say, and I feel comfortable in saying that, no, that isn't the case.
Well, I think we are coming as usual. You could talk. I feel like we're just scraping the surface of my own ignorance above all. So really appreciate Sean and Karl, you coming back onto the podcast again. I just feel that every time we speak, we just learn so much. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having us. To your listeners, don't forget to tune in to One Dish One Mic every Saturday.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And we'll make sure everything's included in the show notes as well. But yeah, do listen to One Dish One Mic. It's awesome, and you'll learn a lot.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns, or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
Hello, where's this going?
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.